In the middle of the 17th century, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, whose name was Nikin, introduced liturgical reforms into the Russian Orthodox Church for the purpose of bringing the ritualistic practices of the Russian Church into conformity with other Orthodox national churches. Many of the Russian people, however, opposed these reforms because they thought they were influenced by Western practices. Those who opposed the reforms became known as Old Ritualists or Old Believers. Now, the kinds of reforms that were made by the Patriarch Nikin would seem to be unimportant. For example, the Russians had prayed in what they called the two-fingered sign of the cross, 2 fingers representing 2 natures of Christ and 3 representing the Trinity. The Patriarch Nikin introduced the reform indicating that they should bless themselves with the 3 fingers, which represented the Trinity. For the old ritualists, this was a terrible change because it meant that the Holy Trinity was on the cross rather than 2 natures of Christ. There were a number of other things, such as the double Alleluia or the triple Alleluia, some changing of the grammatical aspects in the church books, the spelling of Jesus from Isus, which it had been, to Iisus. Now, this sounds very minor, but for these people it was a significant aspect because it was what they believed in. I think it's difficult in some ways to explain to probably people, particularly of Western European cultural backgrounds. A person of even an Eastern non-Christian religion might better understand than some Western Christian people. Eastern religions, there's a great sense of spirituality, and there's something very mystical to them. That sense of mystical belonging brings tremendous gratification.
Turgenev, who was a very westernized writer, once said, "Scratch a Russian and you find an old believer." That one of the things that they represent the kind of the hardcore of what's distinctively Russian about the Russians. And it's been my life's task to try to probe a little bit into that question of what is especially Russian about the Russians. You're seeing it, people talk about Russian nationalism today. People talk about kind of Russian self-consciousness, and the Old Believers are very much at the heart of it. And so they were the hardcore of what's different. What makes the Old Believers so indicative of what's distinctively Russian is their belief that you don't just have a church, you have a kind of organic religious society. Your whole life is built around and is conceived of as a form of religious devotion and religious existence. That's a medieval frame of mind that we rarely have.
If you were to come to Orthodox services, Old Rite services, and any Orthodox services for a while, and you really began to listen to the homilies written 1,500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you'd realize that all people at that time prayed for many hours, fasted for many days. It's something very novel in the history of the world that people really live in such a manner without prayer and fasting. The all-night vigil really consists of placing Vespers and Matins, which are usually 2 separate services, together in a vigil service. Now, in the early Christian era, these services really ran all night, and that's why they're called all-night vigil. Over a period of centuries, they were perhaps shortened a little bit, but I guess by today's Western standards, they're still rather long, about 5 hours. One of the problems of our time has been this kind of idea that materialization, secularization, is some wonderful technological advance. Because we're technologically advanced, we think we're much more educated and much more intelligent than any generation of mankind before us. Then if you start to read the philosophical writings even of the pre-Christian times and the early Christian times, you realize that the average American or Western European is not even able to begin to comprehend these writings because literally we become boobs of the television age. And so while we think that we have grown so much and we're so much more advanced, in many ways we are not more advanced, even though we may be technologically advanced.
And welcome to the Library of Congress to this special event which symbolizes change within the Soviet Union and in the relationship between our countries. We on the western frontier of Europe are indeed grateful to have these rarely seen treasures from the eastern frontier on view in Washington at the time of our summit, and to have the esteemed First Lady of the Soviet Union herself here for the opening.
This is an exhibit which Dr. Billington has wanted to put on for a long time, I think since he first saw Old Believer manuscripts in the early 60s. And one of the men that he worked closely with then, a man called Dmitry Ligachev, is a very important member of the Academy in Leningrad and a student of an expert on Old Russian literature. And he, essentially, Ligachev made available to us many of the books, and the timing was right. The show was put together with his blessing, and that, I think, was understood. And it was also understood that Mrs. Gorbachev had a great deal of interest in seeing these. That made a big difference. There were certain scholars who were skeptical of the motives involved, and had to be convinced that, that it was going to be done not as a political grace note to the summit, but it was going to be done with scholarly integrity, that we were going to do a show which did tell a story, was rigorous in a scholarly way, and that we were going to produce a catalog and a show that they could be proud of.
Все, что находится на этой выставке, нам дорого.
We hold dear everything you will see among the exhibits.
Великий писатель Горький назвал книгу «Чудом из чудес, сотворенных человечеством».
One of our outstanding writers, by the name of Gorky, referred to the book as one of the wonders from among the wonders of mankind.
When we went to choose some of the objects for the exhibit, this was the sort of thing that we were looking for. It's not only a very important book, but it's also a very beautiful book and is unique. And we're very lucky at the library to have this. And it's also a very important text. It was the basic theological text that the old believers of all persuasions used. This is a fairly early copy, and one that's particularly interesting because it has depictions of the way that people should hold their hands in blessing, which was a matter of great controversy among the old believers. This particular copy, which the Law Library owns, was done in the 1720s, that is, during the end of Peter the Great's reign. There were so many new laws that Peter the Great had introduced that they had to reissue the law code from 1649. And what's so interesting about this is that it was done not by a printing press, but by scribes. And on the left-hand column on both pages, you can see the law code as written in 1649. And the right-hand columns, in separate hands, you can see commentaries, additions, emendations that were made in the 1700s. We chose books from two places in the Soviet Union. One is a church, an Old Believer church, which is still active in Moscow, and the other is the Academy of Sciences in Leningrad. They have a big archive up there where they collect Old Russian manuscripts, and they have quite a number of very impressive Old Believer manuscripts.
I think it's very important that our country, America, recognize and show some interest in the things that are most different about another country. I mean, it's not only important to have cultural and intellectual exchanges, it's important to have sympathy for some kind of inner understanding of what is most different about other people. And this is something very different. And therefore, I think they kind of appreciated that we took cognizance of this during the summit when you're basically summiteers. Politicians are always trying to find what's in common that they can work on. But to enrich our sense of the potential of the human experience and to really get to respect people, you have to respect their differentness, what's different, what's unique about them. And so that was what was particularly pleasing about this exhibit, I think.
Books are the most intimate form of communication between two people, much more intimate than a painting. I mean, these are hand-produced books. You know, you can. The staff, when we were putting the show together, everybody wanted to touch the books. Everybody wanted to hold them. Everybody wanted to flip through them, because we knew they'd been done by hand, and that people could speak across generations. This is, well, quite humble-looking, perhaps the most valuable object which the Russians lent to us, because it is the autobiography of the monk Epiphany, written in his own hand while he was in prison in the 1670s. They dug a big pit in the ground and stuck him in it, and there he wrote his autobiography, that is, the tale of his own sufferings and martyrdom. And it was eventually burned with his spiritual son, Avakum. And this particular manuscript was discovered within the past 20 years. People didn't suspect that it even existed. In 1906, the Old Believers were for the first time given the civil right to produce their own books. They were given access to printing presses for the very first time. But they were so in love with the ornamentation of hand-done books that they commissioned this book to be printed according to a model of a hand-done book done in 1834. It was printed, and then they hired somebody to add hand illumination to it. Not only is that interesting, but it's also very ironic that this book was printed on a military printing press, something that was completely unthinkable even 10 years before.
И проявил уважение к нашей стране, к нашей истории и культуре.
You
Спасибо.
have shown respect towards my country, towards our history, and towards our culture by coming here. I thank you.
It is a little hard for me to talk about these new developments in Russia because I'm not part of it. I'm just watching it from the outside. But of course there are some changes, and changes for the better. And the way I put it, the changes are for the better because it couldn't have been worse. The changes are not sufficient for us to change our basic attitude. Maybe there are good intentions behind these changes, but still they are like those good intentions that are supposed that certain unmentionable highways supposed to be paved with. There's only intentions. And as far as acts and deeds go, there is still very little done in this respect.
Many of the laws which are restrictive of the Old Believers have been removed. But this exhibit was very important for the Old Believers themselves because, in fact, the Orthodox Church is a legal entity, but the Old Believers are not. And we had to negotiate through the Ministry of Culture with the Old Believer community because they were not legally empowered to make a deal with a foreign government. And I think that the Old Believers, through the attention that they got directly, by Mrs. Gorbachev in particular, it's bolstered their position a great deal within the Soviet Union. In many ways, glasnost and perestroika and the revolution which is going on in Russia now is being worked out not just in the political field, but also in some ways primarily in the cultural field.
Well, they're like glasnost in the sense that they are given freedom, more freedom. They want a freedom of conscience law. And in fact, the Old Believers argue that the regular Orthodox Church was too corrupted by being compromised with the communist state, whereas their church, which kept their authentic religious point of view, is a much better basis for reconstructing society than the Orthodox Church, which was kind of half in cahoots, at least at the higher levels, with the Soviet state. So again, and in a situation like you have today, where they're trying to re-legitimize the whole system, where they're looking for somebody who hasn't been telling them lies, the Old Believers are seen as telling people uncomfortable truths that people aren't quite willing to accept.
I think that if things do progress in the desirable direction, then it will be possible for different religions, including ourselves, to exercise our religion in Russia more freely. And it is quite possible that we are going to have parishes in Russia affiliated with our church. But my general idea is that the Russian immigration and the people who are staying outside of Russia, that even if things get better, they will not return. But just the opposite is about to happen. Because of a normalization of the conditions in Russia, people will be able to get out. And many people will take advantage of this. But those who will get out, it will be those
who are extremely against the Soviet regime. They will take the first opportunity to get out. And probably the Russian immigration will not cease to exist. It will have a job to do. And probably there will be more of us and more to the right side of the political spectrum.
The Old Believers are a people of the diaspora, but it's a slightly different diaspora. First of all, they did go out of the main centers. They out into the woods, into these far-off, benighted regions, marshes and swamps. They still come wandering out of the taiga, the great inner tundra of Siberia from time to time. One read not long ago that on some sort of missile base or some great secret installation out in the middle of nowhere, suddenly some Old Believers were wandering through it because they'd lived there for years and nobody ever noticed them. So they are people of the diaspora, but they're diaspora in a different sense. First of all, there was a martyrology. They were really persecuted, and then many of them burned themselves. There was this immolation. You see the Mussorgsky's opera, Khovanshchina, his last great opera. Again, this fascination of the 19th century with the Old Believers is representing the hardcore of that what was distinctively different in Russia. Depicts this burning, self-immolation of the Old Believers. So they were both persecuted, they burned themselves, anticipating the fires of the Last Judgment, thinking that the reign of the Antichrist was at hand. They wanted to anticipate the purgative fires of the Last Judgment. I mean, it's a ghoulish thing to think about, but it's rather heroic in a strange sort of way.
This is a book of the Apocalypse, which was a very commonly copied book among the Old Believers, because they believed that the reign of Antichrist had begun or was about to begin. They would spend a great deal of time copying the Apocalypse and writing commentaries and interpretations to it. This depicts the moment when when the sky is unrolling before St. John, who beheld this vision, and you can see an angel coming with a scythe to gather the souls which are condemned to death. The Orthodox believe that prayers of the living could help the sinners who had died before them to reach heaven faster. And so they would compile books which they would use to pray, to suggest prayers for different people. They also thought it was instructive for the living to contemplate death. And so these books essentially serve two purposes: to pray for the dead and to think about one's own death, be reminded of one's own mortality.
A lot of the books in our exhibit, for instance, some of them were as recent as the 1950s, but they're authentically done in the old style, so that it's very hard to date Old Believer manuscripts or Old Believer paintings, because there's a great deal of regional variety because they're very close to the soil and they're close to the folkloristic traditions of whatever region they're in. But the form, the general style, the forms of musical notation, the rather abstract and dematerialized way that they make their icons, that's preserved very authentically and is constantly being replicated without incorporating new influences all along. And you see, the Old Believers, the key thing there was that they represented the most intense assertion of something that most Russians believe a little bit, and that is that there's something wholesome and powerful and authentic about being close to the land and close to the old practices of a very demanding religion. Russians believe that in varying degrees, but partly because their material conditions have always been worse than the West. They came along a little later. They were retarded in that sense by the long Mongol occupation and the difficult, harsh weather conditions. Both the natural enemies and the historic foes that they had to face were so great that the Russians had to compensate for the fact that they had a tougher life by believing that somehow they were more virtuous, that they were more authentic. They were closer to the land, closer to the true traditions of Christianity, which the others had lost. And so that's the sort of, and because they defend this with their lives, are willing to burn themselves, are willing to flee into incredible climatic conditions, they somehow attract everybody's admiration, even people that can't share their views and don't even understand what they are.
I was the first person in our family to marry outside of the church. But at that time, unfortunately, religion wasn't a real top priority with me. Once I had children, I realized the importance of, coming to church and being at church and going to church and not having him be a member. That was really difficult.
It took about 5 years before I finally made a decision to convert. It wasn't something I wanted to jump right into, and my first impression was very standoffish. What is this? It's so different from anything else that you see or other services I've gone to, that it took a while. It's a sacrifice. It's definitely a sacrifice to be an Orthodox Christian today. It's not a commitment of 1 hour a week. It's a lifestyle that you do 24 hours a day. And so much of the world today is too much having fun and not enough attention paid to things that we feel are important.
Particularly in a place like America, where we're so caught up with our material world, it's very difficult for us to be able to concentrate. One of the reasons we think we need the long services is because after a while you kind of are able to put away the things of the world, and your mind is better able to focus in on where you're at and what it's all about. If you really notice in the church, you'll find that people in the Orthodox Church, people pray at the same time. They make the sign of the cross at the same time. It is if you pray alone, it is your prayer. When we come together, the prayer of many of us is more powerful, more effective before God. And so we should be praying as if one mind before God. There is a prayer that says, "Let my prayer be set forth as incense before thee." The significance or symbolism of sensing is that, like the smoke with incense in it smells good and rises up in a cloud of smoke, so may our prayers be acceptable to God. May they rise up to God in the heavens, and may they be pleasing to him like the sweet smell of the incense. And so the church has sensed a number of times with the symbolic aspect of the sweet smell to all of the parishioners. There's a tremendous sense of using of the senses in Orthodox services. And this is one of the ways of using the senses, but using the senses not so much for secular means here, but for spiritual, to uplift our spiritual senses. And that's why sensing is done in a number of times in the services. One of the other things that the old believers maintained that was lost, it's a very critical aspect. When the Russians received their religion from the Greeks, they picked up basic Byzantine chant. Now they put a unique Russian aspect to it, or Slavic aspect to it, and it became known as Znameny chant. Znameny chant means chant by signs. There are little signs showing how to sing, the pitch, the tone, the direction of the melody. Well, most people who hear this chant for the first time find it very different. It's because it's a very ancient chant known as Znameny chant, only used now by the old believers, although some Russian Orthodox are trying to get it back because they realize its antiquity. I don't make music merely for the point of making music. I sing to God certain words. My throat should be used to issue those words before God and to make pleasing sounds if I can, but not to have accompanying instruments merely to make that kind of melody for me. Therefore, it is not proper, it's never been proper in the Orthodox Christian Church, in the Eastern Christian Church, to use musical instruments during services.
It's an organic religious way of looking at things, very much like the Amish, who resist in terms of clothes and so forth. The same thing with the beard. You know, you don't want to have the icons all have bearded figures, and so it's a form of sensual self-indulgence to, in effect, reveal the naked face.
Being an Orthodox Christian, men are required or looked upon favorably to have a beard. And as of about a year ago, we were all made to shave our beards. I'm not sure exactly what the reasons were. The company says for safety. But again, being an Orthodox Christian is almost to some extent like an Amish. You can look at an Amish person without knowing anything about them other than they're Amish. You know right away their religion, and therefore you know a lot of their beliefs and the way that they are. And for an Orthodox, it should be the same. You should be able to look at an individual walking down any street in any town and almost pinpoint there's an Orthodox Christian by their beard, by their dress. And this is something that you can no longer do, at least in my given situation?
I think it's very important to understand the situation of this parish. Many of the Russian Orthodox parishes in this country, what we would call New Rite parishes, came to the United States because of the Russian Revolution and came after the Revolution or after World War II. This parish of Old Believers came late last century. We've been here for 100 years. After 100 years, you cannot help but assimilate. What we've tried to do is to focus in on the important aspects of the religious heritage and the Orthodox Christian faith practiced in the Old Rite, and to be very stringent about retaining those. We're doing all right on that, not without struggle. We really were dying. I mean, I must be honest with you. We had a period in the 70s and early 80s when it looked like we were probably not going to make it past another generation. When we adopted the English in the services, and when we came to priesthood, having been priestless Old Believers, it totally turned around our history. There are not a great number of Old Believers in America. That's why, and perhaps you're here, we're rather unique, but you need to understand why. Why didn't Old Believers come here? First of all, Orthodox didn't come in great number because this is basically a Western European country. It began as that, Protestant Roman Catholic. Therefore, to hold to Orthodox traditions was very difficult in America, even more so for Old Believers. So there's really a very limited amount of Old Believers in North America, although there are still millions in Russia. For those Old Believers who exist here, there are now priestless Old Believers and priested Old Believers. If you were to go to a priestless Old Believer church, you would find an nastavnik, a leader, a guide of the church, who would lead the prayers but could not perform functions that must be performed by an ordained priest. This would mean there would not be the full sacraments, no liturgy with communion, no complete confession with absolution of sins, no complete baptism, no complete marriage in the services.
We believe that our religion just is a real special pearl, and that no one else has that pearl.
On a major feast day, or even on a Sunday, there is a veneration either of the icon of the feast, if it's a feast day, or the veneration of the gospel, if it's Sunday. As the people are venerating the icon, they are coming up to pay homage to the Lord himself, whose image is shown on the icon. It is a means for them to show their love for the Savior himself. They cannot kiss his feet in presence. He's not here with us. He is, but not physically. And therefore we kiss his feet on the icon to show our love for him. If a priest is serving, after that he anoints people with oil that has been burning before the icon and makes a sign of the cross on them with the oil. Oil has always been a sign of anointing in the Old and the New Testament. They are anointed with oil in a sense almost as the idea of healing, if not physical healing, certainly spiritual healing that takes place by the very act of the mystery of this great feast day that we're celebrating.
One of the things that struck me immediately when I got to Russia was the fact that the Russians revere books in a way that we take for granted in America. We can print whatever we like. The Russians can't print whatever they like. In some ways, the Old Believer tradition represents a kind of old-fashioned samizdat or self-publishing. As schismatics, they were not allowed to use printing presses. The reason they copied books by hand was because it was the only way they could have their own books. People did this in the 1960s. Solzhenitsyn was copied by hand as well. It's a really lovely tradition.
This is what people don't realize about Russians, that they really are a people of the book. Russians love to read. And the Old Believers were great readers. And they produced these books out in the wilderness, and they always built their community around the book because they wanted the books. And the split came when the church tried to modernize and print uniform books and change the church books, because that was thought to interfere with this kind of organic wholeness of the way things were.
When the Russians now are looking back at their past, trying to discover who they are, they turn first to the Orthodox Church as a repository of many of their own spiritual values. But within the Orthodox Church, they look even deeper into the Old Believer tradition, because it was one which is most pure in many Russians' eyes, never having compromised with the Tsarist state, never having compromised with the Soviet state. And you see, the Russian Orthodox Church did strike deals with the Soviet state. In a way, the Old Believers have a kind of instant credibility nowadays because they were persecuted by Tsar and Bolshevik alike.
I would sum up my attitude as a kind of cautious optimism. But we have to see, and what has been done is not enough for us, for Russian immigrants who have fled the country out of protest. As some people put it, we have voted with our feet.
The immanence of kind of God's presence in both nature and time, and the fact that everything was part of a religious experience, really, survived much longer into the modern era in Russia. You can tell that with the great literature. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky is permeated with religious ideas. We're seeing a religious revival even in the Soviet Union today, despite 70-some years of atheistic rule and propaganda.
The Russians are a people who are, since the revolution and certainly since Stalinist times, in a way cut off from the taproot of their own culture. Stalin went to great lengths to create this fictitious human being called the Soviet man, and he did so at the expense of the Russian man and woman. In many ways, a lot of the past that the Russians specifically, as Russians, have has been homogenized or has been simply erased.
Смогут по достоинству оценить творение национального духа России.
And we are hopeful that all those who will come here and look at the books and manuscripts of old Russia will be able to give due to the creations of the national spirit of Russia, of my country.
Well, I think when you put together an exhibit, you always want to tell a story, and you want to tell a new story. It's really important that you gather items which have a relationship with one another, that talk to each other, and that you set up a dialogue between these objects, and that you interpret them to the public. I was both the curator, and that is, I chose the objects, and I worked with a real top scholar as curator in Leningrad. He came to America during the time of the show and helped me write the show and the labels. But in many ways, what I was doing as the American curator was selecting the objects with an American eye and with an American audience in mind, and knowing that whatever information my co-curator could give me about the books, I would have to translate from not just literally the Russian language into the English language, but from the Russian context into an American context. And whatever treasures he could show us, I had to make available to the American public. And so I was, in many ways, a translator. Everyone interacts with a book in a very, very personal way. Not just the person who produces it, but the person who reads it. And I think that the Library of Congress is able to attract shows like this precisely because it is the Library of Congress. It's known to be the largest library in the world, and it's revered in the Soviet Union as, or respected as, the largest library, but also they find it absolutely awe-inspiring that it's a library which is open to all. The first question everybody asks when they come from Russia is it true that anyone can use the Library of Congress? And we say yes, and it just boggles their mind. I know that Mrs. Gorbachev wanted to open this exhibit at the library because the library is considered a very special cultural treasure in the Soviet Union. Museums are museums, but a library is something different. I remember just before Mrs. Gorbachev arrived in town, the cultural attaché came to see Dr. Billington and myself late one night. And he said to me that he was very concerned about security issues. Why was he very concerned about security issues? He knew we had good security here. He said, "You don't understand, Dr. Smith, or maybe you do understand, that we loan pictures abroad all the time. If something happened to a Rembrandt, if something happened to a Cézanne, we'd be very upset. But these are our books. These are products of our soul, of our soul. And if anything happened to one of the books when they were over here, it would be a major international incident." You do understand, don't you, Dr. Smith? Yes, I understand. And I was very moved because he was saying that we don't hold anything in the world dearer than these books. And we treasure them so much that we want the American public to see them.
Politicians and economists are always trying to minimize the dangers, But it's in the world of culture and intellect and understanding that you maximize the commonalities, because the pursuit of economic gain or of political power tends to be at the expense of somebody else. But the pursuit of truth is totally non-competitive. I mean, one person's gain is somebody else's, if you have the imagination to get it. And the pursuit of truth keeps us from the pursuit of each other. And the pursuit of understanding, the effort to enter sympathetically into another person's point of view and another person's aspirations and artistic expression is an ennobling experience that enables us to feel at one with them, even though we still have political and economic differences. It's, in other words, it's not a competitive business. It's a mutual enrichment business, and it tends to undergird, as you say, it tends to help people see things in a new way, which enables them to transcend old differences by detecting new possibilities.